Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Carrie. And thanks everyone for having me. This is my first third Thursday that I've been to, so I actually hadn't known about these, so kind of a cool thing that you guys are doing, and I appreciate the opportunity to come talk with you. So as Carrie mentioned, my name's Doug. So I have a presentation for you today focused on heat stress. I gave this presentation just a couple weeks ago to Grand Canyon Search and Rescue. So they had asked me to come give a talk to them about heat stress. They were doing a kickoff for May and heat stress prevention type stuff. So I gave a talk, or basically this talk. So there's a lot of like Grand Canyon type references and stuff like that. So um, feel free to interrupt me at any time. I'm not monitoring the chat or anything like that. So just go off mic and and interrupt me at any time if you have any questions or anything like that. But I'm also happy to take questions at the end. So with that, we'll get into it. So really what I want to cover today is talk about the heat stress environment, sort of how we define heat stress. I'll get into human thermoregulation, so how our body responds to being in a hot environment, how being in a hot environment impacts performance and productivity, some pretty straightforward stuff that we can do for heat stress prevention, and then I just have two slides on sort of recognition and treatment of heat illness. So Carrie mentioned a little bit of background of why I'm talking to you today. So I have a PhD in exercise physiology. I specialize in human performance in extreme environments. So I work at a place called the Naval Health Research Center. It's a military research and development command, and I work in the Warfighter Performance Department, and I'm the director of the thermal physiology team. So really, like my mission every day is to improve health, readiness, and performance of sailors and Marines who operate in extreme environments, whether that's heat, cold, kind of anything in between there, a little bit of high altitude stuff as well. So I work with other teams as well within our department. So we do a lot of like cross collaboration. So we have a team that's focused on physical readiness and injury prevention, a team that's really focused on cognitive performance and cognitive science, a team that's really just focused on sleep and fatigue and how to mitigate that, a team that's focused on nutrition and energy, and then a team that's just sort of focused on metabolic and stress physiology. So we all collaborate together on a lot of different things, right? So if you want to know like how you thermoregulate in the heat after sleep deprivation, like we do studies, similar to that. We also collaborate across Department of Defense laboratories, right? So there's other laboratories within the Department of Defense, the Army, and other labs within the Navy that we collaborate pretty frequently on. I just want to give you a little bit of background on some of the research. So these are two photos of the environmental chamber. So my research that I do in the military is split pretty much 50-50. So half of the time I'm out in the field integrated with military units that are training in these sort of intense environments. And then the other time, half the time I'm actually in my lab where I'm actually doing well-controlled research studies under sort of like precisely controlled conditions. So this environmental chamber, it's about 700 square feet. We can control the temperature from minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit all the way up to 135 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can kind of see those two sort of different conditions there. We have two 4-person treadmills, so we can test 8 warfighters at one time under different, conditions. I would say probably the worst condition that we've tested at, we were testing chemical defense gear, and it was 115 degrees Fahrenheit with 85% humidity. And that was like really, really extreme. I think our protocol allowed us to be in there for 2.5 hours, and I don't think anyone made it past like 35, 40 minutes. It was just a really intense, extreme environment. But anyway, that's sort of what that testing environment looks like. Out in the field, this is some of the research that I've been doing up at the Mountain Warfare Training Center. This is specifically looking at the interactions between donating blood in a high altitude environment, right? So there was some concern there from the Navy and the Marine Corps about their blood transfusions that they do out in the field, right? When they have injured, like severely injured warfighters that have hemorrhagic, conditions that they need to replace blood. They can do that out in the field, but they require donors to do that. And so they were taking blood out of sailors and Marines and putting it into others, and they wanted to look at how the donor performed in a high altitude environment, right? Because you're in a hypoxic environment already, and then you're taking blood, which obviously carries oxygen out of the warfighter, and so we wanted to see what that looked like. And the good news was that we didn't really see any impact on performance under loaded rucks and snowshoes and stuff like that. I've also been really involved with the Navy's heat stress prevention program for shipboard operations. So this is on the aircraft carrier, the USS Nimitz. This was a couple years ago out in the Persian Gulf. They're doing combat flight operations. We measure the air temperature at 122 degrees Fahrenheit, so pretty intense conditions that they're working in. And you can see they're wearing a mask, sort of like this blue mask. So we're looking at their metabolic rate, their core temperature, their heart rate, a bunch of their different physiology to see how much of the heat stress is really impacting their ability to perform their job. So that's one of the things that I've been pretty involved with quite a bit over the recent few years. This is a program here looking at cold water immersion and hypothermia. We've been involved with this sort of line of research for a really long time, pretty much ever since I started at the Naval Health Research Center back in 2011. We've been going up to this Mountain Warfare Training Center where they do a cold weather medicine course. And so they basically put them in the water and have them get out of the water, and we are measuring all their physiology, looking at different aspects of hypothermia, how they recover from that, lots of different things there. And these are the type of data that we get, right? So this is minute by minute core temperature. I think this is a subset of the data that we have. It's about 70 warfighters or so. And you can see it's on degrees Celsius, but on the left-hand side there, you can see the core temperature of 35 degrees, that red line that goes across. So anything below that is 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's considered hypothermia, the clinical definition for hypothermia. And so we can really kind of measure the type of physiology and the conditions that they're in, and get some really good information from that. So what you don't see here is the rewarming side of this, of how they recover from this. But we've published quite a bit of manuscripts and things like that on what the best way to recover from hypothermia is. So I just wanted to sort of lay that out there, just sort of my background and the research that I work on. So really what I want to do now is just sort of get into the heat stress environment and sort of talk about that. So as I mentioned, this is this talk was sort of developed for Grand Canyon Search and Rescue, so it's being recycled a bit. But essentially, due to climate change and a warming environment, there's a bunch of models out there that say that things are going to get warmer. And so there was a specific research study that looked at the Grand Canyon specifically. And basically what they said is basically from now until the year 2100, assuming that there's no change in visitation to the Grand Canyon, that heat-related illness is going to increase quite a bit. Essentially, they said it's going to roughly double. So that's a problem. So I told Grand Canyon Search and Rescue that it's something that they need to consider. If they have, and they're collecting data right now in terms of how many heat injuries they have, and sort of what those are classified as in terms of heat exhaustion, heat stroke, that type of stuff. And so really what they want to focus on is trying to get more preventative search and rescue out there to sort of like get ahead of the curve here. So but essentially things are going to get warmer, and so heat stress is very much a hot topic right now in terms of the military, in terms of Grand Canyon, other places like that. So what I wanted to do here is really talk about sort of the big factors that we should be concerned with in terms of search and rescue. So these are kind of like the big five, right? So these are the things that are going to lead to issues within search and rescue, especially with the summer coming up. But really it's environmental conditions. So this is having an elevated wet bulb globe temperature. So I'm going to talk about what the WBGT is. Some of you may know what it is or have heard of it before, but I'm going to talk about that in a couple slides. Increasing your physical exertion. I'm also going to talk about why physical exertion is problematic in terms of heat stress. So what you can see is like physical exertion, uphill travel, heavy pack loads, they're all increasing muscle activity, and your muscles are quite inefficient in terms of when they contract. They're not good. Essentially, there's about 70% of that whole energy process in contracting a muscle is given off as heat. So your muscles are only about 30% efficient, and that 70% of excess energy as heat is basically dumped back into the body. So anytime you have high levels of physical exertion, uphill travel, heavy pack loads, things that are going to increase muscle activity, that really increases your heat strain. And then for us, this is sort of a different sort of thing than what sets us apart from, like, recreational hikers. But really the urgency of us needing to get ingress into a specific location with urgency, and if there's not opportunity to rest, that greatly increases body heat storage. And I'll talk about all these as we sort of go through this. So the first thing I want to talk about is sort of how we measure heat stress, right? So when we normally talk, just in conversation in our everyday, what we're talking about, this is like what the weather apps sort of show, but it's the dry bulb air temperature. And so when you look at a map like this, right, you might think, wow, there's actually, like, in the South and like the western part of the United States, like, I wouldn't want to go there to probably hike on those days because it looks like it's, pretty hot in those locations. And there are other ways to measure heat stress. And the dry bulb air temperature is an important factor, but it's not the best way when we talk about how the body responds to heat stress. So what we use most frequently is what we call the wet bulb globe temperature, or the WBGT. So on the right-hand side, this is the WBGT taken at the same time. And what you can see is that the heat strain model for this is much less intense compared to, if you were just looking at the dry bulb air temperature. And the reason for that is the wet bulb globe temperature is taking into account more factors or more elements of, like, how the body responds to different environmental factors. So, so this is what WBGT looks like and how it kind of matches up to the other ways that we talk about heat stress. So on the left-hand side there, that's on a Navy ship. It's on a destroyer. That's just a handheld heat stress meter. And you can see there's like 3 different sensors. There's a globe temperature, there's a relative humidity sensor, and then there's a dry bulb sensor. And basically that monitor is taking in all those different pieces of information in the environment, and it's calculating a wet bulb globe temperature. And so, like I said, we have different ways of measuring things. So we just have, the regular air temperature, and then we get a little bit better with the heat index. You guys have all probably heard of the heat index. So the heat index takes into account temperature. So that's the dry bulb temperature and also humidity. And that plays into an important role because, when we talk about evaporative cooling and sweating, if it's high humidity, I mean, you guys have all probably experienced this. When you have high humidity, right, your evaporative cooling capabilities aren't as good. And I'll talk about that in a couple slides as well. So you have, these different indexes, but really the best one that's used, it's used by the military, used by a lot of athletic and sports and, different organizations, but it's the wet bulb globe temperature. And again, that takes into account the temperature, the humidity. It also takes into account solar radiation. That's why there's that black globe, because that picks up all the solar load. And then it also takes into account wind, which is the evaporative cooling. And so this is what it looks like if you were to calculate the wet bulb globe temperature. So you can see when we talk about the dry bulb air temperature, it actually only makes up 10% of the full WBGT equation. So it's a pretty, again, it's important, but, in terms of its contribution to heat stress, it's actually, fairly small. What's more important is the wet bulb temperature, and that's where you get into, like, the humidity and how that impacts the body. And then you have 20% of the equation making up the with the globe temperature. So that's like the solar load. This is the heat index. Again, you may have seen this before. So again, this just takes into account temperature, the dry bulb temperature, and then the relative humidity. And then it supposedly is supposed to give you, like, how it actually feels. So if it's 88 degrees, and you have 70% humidity, it's going to feel like 100 degrees. I don't like the the heat index as much as the wet bulb globe temperature, especially because of like the sort of like the recommendations they give, like are kind of vague. It's just like caution, danger, extreme danger. It's not as like, I guess, useful in terms of like what we're doing. Like how do you delineate between danger and extreme caution? So it's kind of vague. It's also measured in the shade, so it doesn't take into account any of the solar load, from the sun or anything like that. So the best thing is wet bulb globe temperature. There's been a lot of research that's been done on the wet bulb globe temperature. The military uses it, as I mentioned. And the nice thing about the wet bulb globe temperature is that it's linked to specific guidelines, right? So you can see if you're measuring WBGT and you're under 80 degrees Fahrenheit, like you can pretty much do anything, right? There's no real restrictions. There's not a lot of heat stress that's going to cause heat strain. But as you start to creep up in your WBGT, and again, you have the solar load, the ambient temperature, the humidity, that all those things are, playing into this. But as that starts to creep up, you have to, you start to get more restrictive guidelines. I'm not sure if anyone's been in the military that's on the call here, but military bases, they generally fly different flag. So it's called a flag condition. And so they'll fly these different colored flags on the bases so that people know really sort of what the heat stress is, on a specific day. And you can see like if you get over 90 degrees for your WBGT, like you shouldn't be doing anything, right? So it's basically everything is stopped. The nice thing about this is that you can also forecast the WBGT, right? So this is just kind of showing like every 12-hour period how the WBGT is changing. And so this is great because you can use it to do some operational planning, right? So if you're going to go do a search and you're trying to organize a team, like maybe you would avoid sort of these peaks right here where it's getting into the red, and that's going to reduce the heat strain on your SAR personnel. And maybe you plan to have it more, at this time. Or you look later in the week and you say, you know what, maybe it's better to go do, whatever mission is later in the week. So WBGT is great for that. There is an app that you can get. It's like really simplistic. It pulls data from the National Weather Service. It's called the Heat Safety app. Just if you're interested, but it basically shows the heat index, and then it does the forecast and the WBGT, and then it also forecasts that. So, if you want to look at a couple days ahead and kind of, do some forecasting in terms of what's going to be, a high heat stress environment, you can sort of use this app. National Weather Service and NOAA also have this sort of like, same type of things to just go online and do that. All right, so we'll get into how the body responds to heat stress. So there's basically two ways. So there's physiological mechanisms and there's behavioral thermoregulation. So we'll start with behavioral. This is where it's voluntary, right? So you're making choices on how, you interact with the environment. And so there are things that you can do to thermoregulate effectively. I'd say these are almost more important than the physiological ones. So I rely more heavily on the behavioral thermoregulation, like you making the right choices to reduce your heat strain. So the first one here is self-termination of physical activity. So like I said, your muscles are super inefficient. And so, if you start to overheat, you can basically stop, right? And your core temperature will come down because you're not generating, a lot of metabolic heat. You can seek out shade. You can remove clothing layers. Give yourself self-care in terms of properly hydrating yourself and fueling yourself, and just having self-awareness of like how you're responding to the environment. So these are all behavioral regulation, thermoregulation things that you can be doing. On the physiological side, physiologically is mostly involuntary. So one of the first responses you have to a hot environment is that you increase skin blood flow, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to take your body heat and dissipate it to the environment. And so you increase skin blood flow to try and, get more heat to the surface of the skin so that it can be dissipated to the environment. And then the other thing that you do is sweat, right? And so sweating is obviously super important. And I'll talk about that in a couple slides as well. All right, you've probably seen a version of this before. This is sort of how the body gains and loses heat. So in terms of gaining heat, there's radiation, right? So this is basically from the sun. That's what we call direct radiation, or from a heat source. You're basically getting it directly from that heat source. Again, for us, it's more likely going to be the sun. You can also have redirected or reflected radiation, or like, hits off the blacktop, or, hits off some rocks and something like that, and you can gain heat that way. You also have conduction. So this is where you're making like actual physical contact with a hot environment. So in this case, it'd be like the hot sand, and you can gain heat that way. You also have convection. So when you have hot air that's moving across your body, it does help with evaporative cooling. But if the air is like basically more than 95 degrees Fahrenheit, it can actually heat you up. And then I talked about the metabolic, just the muscles being super inefficient. And I bring that up just because I do a lot of return to duty testing for naval special warfare, for like SEALs, and they experience quite a few heat injuries throughout the year, just because of their high tempo. So my lab is in San Diego, and we typically get like 10 heat stroke cases, like actual heat stroke, not heat exhaustion, but actual heat stroke cases, where they've like collapsed on the beach in San Diego, and it's like 70 degrees outside. And it's just like, they've just worked so hard, that their body hadn't had a chance to like essentially recover from that. And so we've seen core temperatures of like 107, 108, 109, I think is the highest I've seen, which is like pretty severe in terms of like an elevated core temperature. And again, this is just on the beach in San Diego, right? So it's not like an extreme heat environment, but because like I said, your muscles are so inefficient, you can generate a lot of internal metabolic heat. This is sort of a complex slide, but I just kind of wanted to show you sort of the pathways of thermoregulation and sort of what's going on sort of behind the scenes. So essentially, you have heat that hits the skin. This is from like an external heat load, but you have heat that hits the surface of the skin, and you actually have different temperature receptors. So I've highlighted them here in like red and blue. So you actually have temperature receptors just in your subcutaneous layer that respond to heat. And then you have a whole nother set that respond just to cold. And so essentially what happens here is that your thermoreceptors for heat are activated, and it goes through sort of this like really sort of long pathway where it sends, information up, to your spinal cord, into your brainstem, to the hypothalamus. And then the hypothalamus basically says, okay, we need to make a decision here on how we're going to respond to this information. And in that case, in terms of heat stress, your body acts like a thermostat, and it has some, adjustments that it makes to try and cool yourself. So this is what it looks like, right? Like I said, these are sort of the two primary mechanisms. So you have vasodilation. Well, let me back up, right? So again, pretty straightforward. Your body works as a thermostat. So you have temperature receptors that detect that the temperature is becoming too hot. This information gets sent to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus says like, okay, we need to make a response here in terms of trying to cool ourselves. And again, these are the two primary responses that we have in terms of physiological thermoregulation. So essentially you vasodilate, so you increase the diameter of your blood vessels near the surface of the skin to try and dissipate that heat. So that's, one of the first defenses against overheating. And then the second one is this, producing sweat and getting that sweat to deposit on the surface of the skin, and then getting that to evaporate. So in terms of like sweating, like, your body will sweat, whether it's, dry, like really low humidity, or really high humidity. And so really it's like, once you get that sweat to the surface of the skin, it's kind of up to what happens in the environment, whether or not that's effective. And this is what that actually looks like, right? So this is on the left-hand side. This is like really ideal. So your body can cool itself pretty well in like low humidity conditions. And really the way that this works is that when you sweat, you basically deposit 100% of moisture on the surface of the skin. And if you have 20% humidity in the air, that creates like an 80% delta, right? So basically there's a home for that moisture on the surface of your skin to go to, and that's in the air, right? And so you have this like really nice evaporative cooling effect that happens, and you can cool yourself pretty well with that. On the flip side, if you have really high humidity, this is where you run into issues, right? So you're still going to sweat, as you normally would. You're still going to get that that moisture to the surface of the skin, 100% moisture. But now, because the air is so humid, it won't just readily pick up, all that moisture that's on the surface of the skin. And so unfortunately, what happens is a lot of that sweat just drips to the ground. And again, you guys have probably experienced this before. But when you lower that gradient between the surface of the skin, having 100% moisture, and a really high humidity, and if you only have a 10% delta, then your evaporative cooling is not as effective. And so this is what leads to a lot of overheating in high humid conditions. And this is actually what that looks like. So this is your core temperature and low humidity, right? So you're going to basically take on a little bit of heat from the environment, and you're going to generate, internal metabolic heat. But what you're looking for is you're trying to get to a basically an equilibrium where the heat that you're taking on from the environment and that you're producing metabolically or internally, you're able to dissipate that out back into the environment. And so it kind of creates this like nice equilibrium. And so we can see that happen in like really low humidity environments. But when you get into really high humidity environments, you can't, evaporatively cool yourself that well. And so your core temperature just basically tends to increase to a point where it gets to a dangerous level. Okay, so we'll just quickly go over performance in the heat. So essentially occupational heat exposure, right? So when we're out doing our SAR missions, right, we're at risk for this type of stuff. When we're in hot environments, or if we're going uphill, or we don't have a chance to take a break, or we have heavy pack loads, all those things are going to contribute to basically hyperthermia, right? So as the intensity of the environment, hot environment goes up, or we have more gear that we're taking, or there's more clothing that we have on, or the work intensity is increasing, that leads to increased hyperthermia, or an increase in your core temperature. That increases thermal discomfort, right? It's not fun to be in that environment. And then, of course, you start sweating. However, if these aren't managed very well, you get all these sort of downstream effects. So you actually have impaired cognitive performance. You can become dehydrated if you're not, replacing fluids. You get psychological distress. Like again, you can very much feel that you're like overheated or like gassed and that type of stuff. It actually leads to increased accidents. That's kind of goes in line with the cognitive performance impairment, and then time off task, those types of things. So overall, these all contribute to a lowered physical work capacity in the heat. So not good news, if you have to do a lot of work in the heat or really strenuous work in the heat. This is actually looking at a lot of different studies that looked at productivity loss in the heat as a function of that wet bulb globe temperature. And really all you need to know is that the lower the wet bulb globe temperature, the less severe heat stress there is. And so you can see at really low wet bulb globe temperatures, there's almost like no loss in productivity, right? So everyone can really thermoregulate and perform pretty well in this environment. However, as you start to creep up in that WBGT, you start to see a lot of productivity loss in terms of workers and things like that. And so, right, it just continues to increase to a point where, once you get above like 35 degrees for a WBGT, basically people can't work in that level. And so you almost get like 100% productivity loss. And there's been a lot of work done on like laborers and farm workers and people that are like out in fields, a lot in like Southeast Asia and stuff like that, where they've measured like core temperature and things like that, and all these workers, and looked at their productivity loss. This is sort of the background of why your physical performance is impaired in the heat. So what you can see on the left-hand side here is basically normal blood flow in a nice like cool environment. So you can see about 5% of the blood flows to the skin surface for heat loss. So you can see like you're not really sending a lot of blood to your extremities or to the surface of your skin. And so you kind of have this big reservoir of blood, which sort of looks like this, right? About 95% of your blood is available for muscles for you to go exercise, all that type of stuff. However, when you're in a heat stress condition, because you're trying to dissipate that heat from your core temperature, right, you're starting to send a lot of this blood to the surface of the skin and to your periphery and that type of stuff. And so your basically reservoir that you have available to go exercise and send blood to your muscles for exercise is about half. And so when you get into this sort of like competition, right, you're trying to cool yourself, but your muscles also need, blood flow to continue functioning properly. You run into this issue where your physical performance declines. This is a chart that shows essentially where the blood flow is going, not under heat stress, but under different intensities of exercise. So at rest, you can see, right, it's pretty minimal, right? So your muscles are getting some blood flow under light exercise, moderate exercise, and then maximal exercise. And so you can see you're like pushing close to like 90% of your blood is, required by your muscles during intense exercise. But right, if you're trying to do this in a hot environment, I told you there's only 50% available. And so this is why your physical performance declines. This is a great study. I like to talk about it a lot. It was looking at cyclists, and I like to talk about the study a lot because it shows the performance decline in hot environments, but it also shows how your body can adapt or acclimatize to heat. So essentially, the study looked at cyclists in the heat, and they had them do time trial performances. And so they had them do 4 different trials, essentially. So they had them do a control trial. So they brought them into their lab. They had them exercise at 47 degrees Fahrenheit. And just for reference, like around 48 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit is where your body optimally optimally thermoregulates. Like you get the highest performance output in terms of exercise at around 48 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything above that, you kind of like start to, compete for blood flow, because you're trying to thermoregulate. And then anything below that, your muscles are getting kind of cold. But anyway, so they brought them into this lab, had them do this control trial at 47 degrees. And you can see this is their power output over time in this blue line. And then they said, okay, we're going to have you guys come back, have you do another time trial. So they're basically going to cycle as fast as they can for their best time, but they're going to do it at 98 degrees Fahrenheit and low humidity, 15%. And what you can see is, right, there's a significant decline in their performance, right? And this is because of the demands for heat dissipation and muscle blood flow, right? They're trying to thermoregulate, but also send blood to their exercising muscles. And at the end of the day, thermoregulation is always going to try and win. And so your performance declines. Right, so that's just basically showing the impact of heat stress on physical performance in terms of power output for cycling. So the cool thing about this is that they then said, hey, go away for 5 days, right? And what we want you to do is spend multiple hours each day exercising in the heat, right? So they're doing active heat exposure. And then what they did is they brought them back after 5 days, had them do the same cycling test. And what you can see is that the power output is now increasing, right? So they're actually able to maintain a higher power output over that 27 miles of cycling. And then they said, okay, last time we're going to send you away for actually like 13 days now. And they said, continue to do your active heat exposures, right? You're going to be active in the heat for 4 hours a day. And then they brought them back again. And what you can see is like now you're actually approaching the amount of power that you can output over this time trial is actually approaching the control trial, even though you're in basically, what would that be, like 50-degree higher temperatures between these 2 lines here. And so this is what your body is doing. Essentially, it's becoming heat acclimatized. So your body's making physiological adjustments so that it can perform better in the heat. So it's a pretty cool thing that you can adapt to that. All right, so I'll talk about heat stress prevention just real quick here. So the biggest thing that we can do is rest, right? This is sort of a very simplistic diagram sort of showing like if you don't rest in the red, your core temperature will continue to increase because you're always generating metabolic heat. However, if you do rest, it gives your core temperature enough time to recover, and then you basically do your exercise, your physical exertion activity, whatever that is, and then you rest. And so you can basically maintain this. You're still going to increase in core temperature, but it's going to be at a much less steep slope than if you were to just continually exercise. Right. So that's one of the biggest things that we can do if we're on like a non-urgent SAR mission, right? Just think about building in rest periods, right, for everyone in the group, because this is the sort of response that you'll get in your core temperature, and you'll really reduce the heat strain on the team. This is some of my data that I can show to sort of back that up. This was, I guess, about a month ago. I hiked the Grand Canyon down to the river and back. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the South Kaibab Trail. It's one of the popular trails there from the South Rim. It's about 7 miles down to Phantom Ranch, and then 7 miles back up with about 5,000 feet of elevation gain on the way back up. So it's a pretty, pretty big uphill. And so what I did was I measured my core temperature, right? This is an ingestible core temperature sensor. So you basically just swallow this and you get minute by minute core temperature. And so this is what that day looked like. So this is all going downhill, right? You can see there's a little bit of increase in core temperature. And then I took like a 20-minute rest at Phantom Ranch, down by the river. And then my core temperature dropped. And then I came back up, right? So I started my uphill travel. There's just different places on the uphill return. So there's a place called the Tip Off, which I just kind of continued through. And then I stopped at Skeleton Point, took a rest, core temperature came back down, hiked to another mile or so to Cedar Ridge, stopped, core temperature came back down. And so again, just with resting, you can like really regulate your core temperature pretty well. Again, just through rest, just basically allows your thermoregulatory system to catch up. This is my heart rate response. So I also had a polar heart rate monitor. So you can kind of see, right, going downhill, somewhere around 120-ish beats per minute, take a rest, recovers, coming back uphill, right? And you can see the differences of just walking downhill and the physical loads on the body in terms of like the demands, in terms of how much blood flow is needed to get to your muscles, right? So going downhill, right, pretty straightforward. Coming uphill, like much higher demands in terms of blood flow to all the muscles. And so this is why, right, you're pretty high heart rate. But again, you can recover that, take a rest period, come back down. And so you can kind of see all that happening there. I will say, the air temperature when I did this was 78 degrees. So not like overly hot, right? It's just kind of a nice mild temperature there. All right, in terms of how your body can adjust to heat, this is sort of one of the coolest things. So, right, if you guys have familiar with high altitude acclimatization, very similar in terms of the body making adjustments to adapt to an environment. With heat acclimatizations, very similar to hypoxia and high altitude, it's repeated exposures, right? So that's what your body basically starts to say, if you're going to be putting me in this environment, I'm going to start making adjustments to make it easier for myself. And so you see all these different types of changes. So like your resting heart rate and your exercising heart rate is reduced when you're in the heat. Your resting core temperature and exercising core temperature is reduced. So basically all the high stress or the high strain is getting less. So that's quite good. You also see an increase in heat shock protein. So heat shock proteins are essentially like the search and rescue cells of the body. So they go out and basically repair, denatured cells and all these other cells. So it's quite nice to get an increase in that. Your performance is increased, your perceptions. This is also quite interesting. So not only is the physiology changing, but your perception of the environment is changing. So you don't feel as hot. Your exertion of how you perceive it is getting less. And then you also increase your sweat. You increase the volume of sweat. You will also increase your sweat sensitivity. And one of the pretty cool things is that you actually hang on to more electrolytes. So you're still you're producing more sweat, but you're hanging on to more electrolytes as you sweat. So that's kind of cool too as well. General like sort of heat acclimatization strategies, right? So if you're going to be going to a hot environment, you want to mimic the anticipated deployment environment. What says deployments? This is from the Army. But you basically want to mimic whatever environment you're going to be going into. You want to ensure that you do have adequate heat stress, right? So if you're just going, into a hot environment for 5 minutes a day, like that's not going to be enough. So you want to make sure that your body's experiencing, some level of heat strain to promote heat acclimatization. Typically, it takes about 2 to 3 weeks to develop heat acclimatization, but it does require some time, right? It's basically somewhere between 90 to 100 minutes a day of being in the heat, right? So if you work outside, right, you can achieve that easily. However, if you're like sitting in an office, like you're gonna have to put some effort in to become heat acclimatized. Certainly start slowly, right? So you want to build up. Like I said, it takes time to build this. It's not something that just happens in a day or two. use work rest cycles, right? So you don't just go out there and, run 13 miles and expect to be heat acclimatized. You kind of have to, work at it. Another thing here is that if you discontinue your heat exposures, you can retain your heat acclimatization for about a week, but then after a couple of weeks, it's completely lost. And so what they see is basically after a month, it's almost completely gone, and you have to kind of start all over again. All right, just a couple more slides here. This was some heat illness records from 2004 to 2009, so a little bit outdated, but this is the most recent that Grand Canyon has, looking at heat illness. And what you can see here, right, these are all the paramedic assessments that they had. And what you can see is that 66% of all heat-related illnesses were either dehydration, heat exhaustion, or hyponatremia. So basically, people are drinking too much water, not replacing electrolytes. They're not drinking enough water, or they're just essentially overheating to a point where they're becoming heat exhausted. Right. And so I would suspect this is like probably something similar that we would see if we had, heat-related illness in our, search and rescue callouts. These other things certainly do happen, right? In terms of like heat stroke, they do happen. They're just not as common as, these other things here. So just to give you sort of a prevalence of the type of heat illnesses that occur. In terms of classification of heat illness, it's really sort of like a continuum, right? It's not that you just like jump from one to the other, right? So you start out with hyperthermia, basically just you're increasing your core body temperature. Nothing wrong with that, right? Anytime we go out and exercise, we do that. But when you start to get into some of these other ones, is like mild heat edema, you have swelling, heat cramps, heat syncope, and then really like, again, the most common one that we would see is heat exhaustion. So these are people that are like, they're really weak, fatigued, sometimes have anxiety, dizziness. That's sort of typical what you see. And then in terms of heat stroke, obviously this is the most severe one. It's an elevated core temperature above 104 degrees. And the big thing here is that you get an altered mental status, right? So heat exhaustion, usually they're with it, they're just fatigued, they're not feeling well. Heat stroke, they're really like, there's changes in their mental status that are kind of a tip off for you. So this is the Wilderness Medical Society. Every 5 years, they publish new clinical practice guidelines. It's a great document. It just recently came out in 2024. I can certainly send this out to the group if you guys are interested in taking a look at this. But it has all the heat stress prevention and treatment guidelines for heat illness. And in terms of treatment of heat stroke, I think this is an important slide here, right? We've all kind of maybe heard of different methods or maybe even used different methods to cool people. Essentially everything on the right side here, this is all immersion in cold water. Specifically, this is ice water immersion, and this is the cooling rate that you get in your core temperature, right? So you can see like you're getting it like close to 0.3, 0.35 if you dunk someone whole body into an ice bath, right? And so you can get some really fast cooling rates with this, and that's good. And then you have sort of on the other end of the spectrum, you have ice packs, right? So you've heard of probably putting ice packs on like major arteries and things like that. Not as effective. And then you have sort of somewhere in between, right? Kind of in the middle. This is probably what we would do in terms of like field is basically, we may not have cold water. And so it's sort of like tap or like tepid water, just splashing that on the individual and then using fans to cool them off to, help with that evaporative cooling and then getting them into the shade. And that is kind of like your middle of the road. But I think that's a fairly good compromise, right? Because we don't really have out in the field have access to really cold water in hot environments. And you can really see how that plays out in terms of the calculations, right? So if you have someone who just meets the definition of heat stroke, which is again a core temperature of 104, and you're using some of these like at the left hand of the graph here, some of these lower cooling rates, you can see that over 30 minutes, you've only cooled them by like just a few degrees. It's not anything that's like, really significant. And that's important because, there's a lot of research that is emerging right now that basically shows that the time that your core temperature is elevated in a really hot environment is what's associated with a poor prognosis for those that are having heat stroke. So you want to try and get them down to a lower core temperature as quickly as possible. So you can see on the other side, in terms of using cold water immersion, right? If you have a 0.3, sort of like closer on this scale, you can see in 10 minutes, you're already back to 98.6, right? So that's kind of why this is an important graph to show in terms of, how effective you are at cooling someone. All right, so this is the last slide I have. So this is just kind of wrapping up everything together in terms of best practices to reduce your risk of heat strain and heat stress. So I've kind of broken this up of things that you can do before emission, during emission, and after emission. So again, if you know that you're going to be working in a hot environment, right, heat acclimatized. Here in Flagstaff, we're at 7,000 feet. We do go down into Sedona, which can get, pretty hot. And we do parts of the Grand Canyon as well. And so, right, it would be good for us because we have exposure to those types of environments to actually do some, active heat acclimatization to sort of prepare for those missions. Certainly knowing your environment, right, knowing what the weather conditions are going to be, the terrain, right, are you going to be headed uphill? That's a big consideration in terms of heat stress. Making sure you're prepared, having, hydration, food, clothing, gear, all that type of stuff. Route selection, this is a big one too, right? Can you access your patient by walking downhill? If so, you're going to reduce heat stress or heat strain on your team versus if you have to access them from a lower point and walk uphill, right? That's going to create more of that internal metabolic heat. Having contingency plans for routes and resources, right? Maybe you're looking at a map and if you're in a low water environment, trying to, identify water sources, things like that. This is probably the most critical one is just doing a self-assessment, right? Making sure you're physically and mentally ready to go, knowing your limits, and then making a final decision, just keeping in mind that, your safety is the priority. In terms of during a mission, I kind of said this many times throughout, but if you can rest, right, if it's a non-critical thing, rest often to let your core temperature come back down. Use motorized SAR assets, right? So instead of having to walk somewhere, have someone drive you somewhere. Again, you're just trying to lessen your physical exertion. This is kind of goes without saying, but distribute gear loads among the team so not one person is, having to take the brunt of the load. Certainly hydrate and fuel. It's probably a good idea to, as you're out doing a lot of these SAR missions to get a good understanding of how your body responds to different environments. I know that this, on like a pretty mild day in the Grand Canyon, this 200-260 formula is like 200 mLs of water, 200 calories every 60 minutes or every 1 hour, right? That's what works for me, right? And so it's really knowing your body and knowing what it needs to operate in different environments, right? And don't be afraid to set an alarm, right? Especially like in a mission setting. It's very easy to get that tunnel vision. And so it's very easy to ignore some of these things. You see it a lot in the military. They just ignore drinking water because they're so focused on, the mission and what's going on around them. And so it's super important to make sure you are taking care of yourself. Certainly be flexible, right? If plans change, that's also important as well. And then after the mission, self-reflecting, how did it go? Was it hydrated properly? What was my pace, my hydration, my fuel, my condition afterwards? Was I just like really gassed at the end? All these types of things are important to know. And right, you can feed that back into before you go on your next mission. And this is sort of like a cyclical process in terms of, really getting to know your body and how it responds to different environments and especially heat stress. So with that, appreciate your time. That's kind of all I have. I know that was kind of a lot of information all at once, but happy to take any questions.
Yes, we have a couple of questions in the chat, Doug, so I'll read those off to you. The first one from Philip is this suggesting that having water to drink is better than the same weight in cold packs?
Sorry, is the question, let me just make sure I understand the question.
Yeah.
So is having water in your pack better than having cold packs in terms of the same weight for cooling individuals?
Yes.
I think that's
To
probably
cool a patient, to cool a patient.
Yeah, I would choose water, right? Pretty much all right. Those heat packs, like especially if you're, or sorry, those cold packs, especially if you're in like a hot environment, like those aren't going to last like too long. But right, you can really get someone's like clothing wet to keep them cooler and to get that evaporative cooling like going for longer. So in terms of weight, if you're sitting there and you have an Nalgene liter and you have, you know, the same weight in cold packs, I would certainly take the water. It's going to do more. You have more options to do that, especially if they're dehydrated. Yeah, that's going to be water is the best way to go, I think, in that situation.
Okay. And then we have a multi-part question, so we'll work our way through this next one from Zachary. Thank you so much for this presentation, Doug. With the majority of your hypothermia tests, what method are you using to measure core temperature? You mentioned a thermometer pill that you took on a trip. How does the temperature data you collect from your stomach compare to an esophageal or rectal temp probe?
Yeah, so we've really thanks for the question. We've really kind of broken open in terms of technology. So in terms of the testing that we do, it used to all be rectal temperature or esophageal temperature. In terms of like from a research perspective, in terms of compliance, like the pill is a much better way to go. There's been quite a few studies, and I can certainly send those to you. Right, if you want to send me an email, I can send those studies to you. But the you know, we call it the core temperature sort of either way, but it's really the gastrointestinal temperature that the pill is picking up, right? Because you swallow and it goes into your GI system. That actually has really good agreement with rectal temperature and esophageal temperature. There's just, it's a little bit like you have to do a little bit more planning in terms of using the core temperature sensor because you can't just give it to someone right away. Like rectal temperature, you could just basically get a rectal temperature right as soon as you insert the you know, the thermometer or whatever. Right, that's like an instant thing. But with the core temperature sensor, the ingestible one with the pill, it takes about 4 to 6 hours to location to get to a location in your GI system where it's not influenced by sort of outside ambient things. So like if you take an ingestible sensor and then you drink coffee, right, that's gonna, you know, falsely increase the reading. So we usually give it about 4 to 6 hours in advance. But it really does allow us to get some pretty unique data sets, right? We've used the core temperature sensors, the ingestible ones in pilots, in divers, in ground forces, those are doing cold water immersion, you know, activities. So we can really collect some pretty unique data in some unique environments with the core temperature pill.
Okay, and then is electrical light retention after heat training significant? And is there any data to support that online?
It is, yeah. It is, yeah, yeah. So I can send you some articles on heat climatization as well, if you're interested in those. But yeah, it is significant. I don't know like the actual like millimoles per liter in terms of like how many, yeah, how much electrolytes you are retaining. I don't know that off the top of my head. But yeah, it's significant enough that it makes a difference, right? So when you sweat, right after you become heat acclimatized, you're basically hanging on to a lot more electrolytes. Basically, it's like sodium chloride. Um, and yeah, that does make a difference in terms of, you know, your uh, electrolyte balance and stuff like that. So
Okay, the next question is regarding the temperature of water that you're drinking and the effect on core temperature. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts on that?
yeah, I guess there's been some studies that have looked at like ice slurry ingestion, where they look at right, so you're not like eating ice and you're not just drinking cold water, but it's like ice slurry ingestion. So it's kind of like a mixture of, I guess the best thing to call it would be like an icy. But essentially that does have a little bit of an impact, but it depends on what you're doing, right? So if you have really high physical exertion levels, that's going to just quickly override the amount of like cooling benefit you get from that. But if you're just like sitting in a hot environment and you're drinking that, that actually does have like some decent cooling effects that can, you know, last for a little bit longer. So it kind of depends on, you know, the environment that you're in and the physical exertion levels that you're at. But just drinking cold water, if you're like on the move and, you know, doing a lot, it doesn't do a lot in terms of keeping your body temperature a lot lower. You're just going to sort of override that with the amount of physical exertion that you're doing.
Okay. And the last one, it looks like a question or request we have is if you could request or suggest more resources on heat acclimatization.
Um, Someone wants resources on heat acclimatization. Okay. Yeah, I can send out some documents. I'll just switch the slide here quickly. These are some really good ones. So NIOSH puts out occupational exposure to heat and hot environments. So that's like, I think like a 200-page document. There's like a 100-page document that the Army put out, and they update it frequently. So it's the Technical Bulletin Medical 507. It's called Heat Stress Control and Heat Casualty Management. I don't know if I think there might be a little bit of information from the Wilderness Medical Society there, but those are sort of like the three top documents that are sort of like reference in terms of heat stress. And there's quite a bit of information on acclimatization for sure in the technical bulletin from the Army, that heat stress control and heat casualty management. So I can send those out. I can also send these slides out. There's the first few slides that have some of the warfighters going through the different like research projects that won't be included. But in terms of all this other stuff, like it's all just reference research, right? So you can see at the bottom on most of these slides here, this is all reference research that's publicly available. So I can just send these slides out with those other documents. I guess, Carrie, I can send them to you and you can push them out if that works.
Yeah, or you guys can reach out to Doug if you want to share your email address there again. We can do it both ways. So feel free to reach out to me or reach out to Doug's email there and he can send them to you directly. And with that being said, thank you so much for your time tonight, Doug. Really appreciate it. This was great content. And everybody feel free to reach out if you have any further questions that you think of later. Thank you again. Have a good
Yeah,
night.
thank you. Appreciate it. Everyone have a good night.